Michelle Trachtenberg's final home was a Victorian estate nestled in the hills above Los Angeles, a place of quiet beauty and isolation. She had purchased it in 2017, drawn to its old-world charm, high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a sprawling garden where jasmine bloomed year-round. But as the years passed, the house became more than just her refuge. It became her world. When news broke on February 26, 2025, that Michelle had passed away, the house became an object of morbid fascination. Fans gathered at the gates, leaving flowers and letters. Paparazzi circled, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever secrets the estate might hold. But after the headlines faded, the house stood empty, its doors locked, its windows dark. Within weeks, whispers of its sale began. Some speculated that it would remain untouched, a shrine to the actress's memory. Others believed it would be quietly sold to someone who didn't mind the weight of its history. By the end of the month, it had new owners, David and Rachel Whitmore, a couple in their early 40s looking for a fresh start. They weren't the type to be deterred by celebrity pasts or lingering rumors. David, a novelist, was drawn to the house's solitude, convinced it would help him focus on his work. Rachel, an interior designer, saw endless potential in its faded grandeur. They dismissed the stories, the whispers that Michelle had been troubled in her final days, that she had spoken of feeling watched even when she was alone. For them, it was just a house, at least at first. Now, as they settle in, small things give them pause. The scent of jasmine lingers in the hallways, no matter how many times Rachel repaints or redecorates. At night, David swears he hears faint strains of piano music, though they own no instrument. Their dog, Murphy, refuses to enter the master bedroom, standing at the threshold with his ears pinned back. It's nothing, they tell themselves, just their imagination. But some nights, when Rachel walks past the grand mirror in the upstairs hall, she catches a glimpse of something just for a second. A reflection that isn't hers. A shadow standing where no one should be. She never stops to look, and she never ever turns around. The house stood beneath a thick February sky, its gabled roof and ivy-clad walls dark against the pale hush of morning. The air smelled of damp earth and distant rain, the Hollywood Hills blanketed in an early fog that curled like ghostly fingers around the bare branches of the ancient jacaranda in the front yard. Somewhere below, the city stirred car engines humming, unseen voices rising and falling in the valley. But up here, in this place, time felt different, slower, stilled. Rachel Whitmore tightened her coat around herself as she stood on the wide wraparound porch, staring at the door as if waiting for something, an invitation, perhaps, or a reason to turn back. The house loomed before her, watching. She had never been the type to indulge in superstition, but something about it, something about her, made her hesitate. Michelle Trachtenberg had lived here, had died here, not within the walls as far as the official reports claimed, but nearby in circumstances vague enough to let the imagination wander. There had been no funeral, at least not a public one. No details, just a quiet statement from her longtime agent, a few hastily written obituaries, and then silence. The world had moved on as it always did, and yet here she was, standing in the place where that silence had begun. Behind her, David was still unloading the car, preoccupied with the mundanities of moving day. Boxes scraped against the stone steps, boots thudded against the porch as he heaved their belongings inside. It was grounding, ordinary, and she clung to it. She stepped forward, gripping the brass handle, its surface cool beneath her fingertips. The door creaked as it swung inward. The air inside was still, as though it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone to return. The house smelled of old wood, faded lavender, and something else. A whisper of jasmine, delicate and lingering. Rachel told herself it was just the remnants of forgotten perfume absorbed into the fabric of the curtains, the upholstery of the chaise lounge that sat by the bay window, the wooden beams that had soaked up years of life and memory. But as she moved deeper inside, her footsteps softened by the thick Persian rug stretching across the hallway. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was not empty, that it had never truly been empty. It was beautiful in its way, grand but melancholy, like something left behind in another century, forgotten in a world that had long since moved past its prime. The ceilings were high, laced with intricate molding that curved like waves meeting in the center of the room. The chandeliers above were dulled with dust but still magnificent, their crystals catching the dim winter light and scattering it across the walls in fractured pieces. She ran a hand along the carved banister of the grand staircase, tracing the polished wood as she ascended. The house breathed around her, shifting softly in the settling dusk, and as she reached the second-floor landing, the feeling of being watched pressed against her spine. The master bedroom stood at the end of the hallway, its double doors closed, its presence heavier than the others. The last place Michelle had truly called home. Rachel hesitated before turning the handle, but the door swung open before she had the chance. The room was colder than the rest of the house. Not an absence of warmth, but something deeper, a chill that seemed woven into the very bones of the walls. The furniture remained untouched. An antique vanity sat against the far wall, its mirror draped in a thin veil of dust. A small writing desk stood by the window, the chair slightly pulled out, as if someone had just risen from it. The bed, covered in a soft ivory quilt, was perfectly made, except for the faintest indentation in the pillows, as though a head had rested there not long ago. Rachel exhaled, steadying herself. It was nothing, just the weight of expectation of knowing what this place had been, what it had seen. And then, just as she turned to leave, she caught it. A shift in the mirror. Not movement, not exactly. Just the feeling that something had changed, something just out of sight. Her own reflection stared back at her, slightly distorted by the dust and the dimming light. But she wasn't alone in it. A shadow stood behind her, silent and waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Rachel's breath hitched. A slow, involuntary thing, like the body instinctively recognizing a danger before the mind had time to catch up. Her heart pounded a steady, deliberate rhythm against her ribs as her eyes remained locked on the mirror. The shadow was there, no, not a shadow, something more than absence, more than darkness. It had a shape, the faintest suggestion of a presence just outside her field of vision. It stood motionless, undefined yet unmistakable, in the space behind her. She didn't turn around. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to whip around, to look, to confirm what her mind refused to fully grasp. But something deeper, something older, more primal kept her still. The air had changed. The scent of jasmine, faint before, thickened now, as if the very walls had exhaled a memory. It wasn't unpleasant, wasn't even overwhelming, but it felt intentional. Like something had been waiting for her to notice. A quiet creak echoed from the far side of the room, the sound of weight shifting, of presence. Rachel's fingers trembled against the doorframe as she slowly exhaled through her nose, her breath visible in the cold that hadn't been there seconds before. She was overreacting. That's what she told herself. It was the light, the dust, the angle of the mirror playing tricks on her. And yet, she turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the edge of the room from the corner of her eye. There was nothing there. Nothing but the vanity, the window, the faded remnants of a life that had ended too soon. The mirror must have warped over time. That was it. A distortion in the glass. She let out a soft, uneasy laugh, more an exhale than anything, and forced herself to step back, away from the mirror, away from the door. Downstairs, David called her name. The sudden intrusion of his voice sent a jolt through her, grounding her back into something tangible, something safe. Rachel turned, stepping into the hallway, willing herself to shake off the lingering unease. But as she pulled the door shut behind her, something odd caught her eye. The mirror. Even as the room faded from view, she could have sworn that the reflection remained just a fraction of a second too long. By nightfall, the house felt different. David was already lost in his writing, his desk lamp casting a warm golden glow across his notebook as he sat hunched in thought. He had always been like this, able to disappear into his own mind, oblivious to the weight of his surroundings. Rachel envied it. She sat curled on the living room sofa, a half-finished glass of wine resting on the coffee table, the glow of a single lamp leaving most of the room in soft shadows. The air was still, the silence stretching long and thick. It was strange, she thought, how quickly a house could absorb a person. Their presence, their history. This house had absorbed her. Even though Michelle Trachtenberg was gone, there was something of her still here. It was in the faded photographs Rachel had found in the built-in bookshelves upstairs, small, candid snapshots of a woman who had once been full of life. It was in the stack of old scripts left forgotten in a drawer, some marked with scribbled notes in the margins, lines underlined, emphasized. It was in the faint scratches on the wooden floors where a chair had been pushed back one too many times. She was here, not in body but in presence. And then there was the music, soft, faint, barely more than a whisper of sound. Rachel sat up, the hairs along her arms rising as she strained to listen. Piano, somewhere distant, just at the edge of perception. The melody was slow, deliberate, familiar. She knew that piece. Chopin, Nocturne in E-flat major. The realization settled like ice in her stomach. There was no piano in the house. She hadn't brought one, hadn't even seen one when they moved in. Yet the music continued. Delicate, careful, each note pressed with aching precision. Rachel's breath shuddered in her chest as she turned her head toward the hallway. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the master bedroom, from behind the closed door. For a long moment, she sat frozen, watching the darkened staircase with wide, unblinking eyes, half expecting the door to creak open, for something to step out. But nothing came. Nothing changed. The music stopped. As suddenly as it had begun, the house fell silent once more. Rachel let out a slow, unsteady breath. She told herself she was imagining things. That sound traveled in old houses, that maybe one of the neighbors was playing music, that it wasn't what it seemed. And yet, as she turned back to her wine, forcing herself to settle, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been listening, and that it was waiting. The silence in the house stretched, thick and unmoving, like the air before a storm. Rachel sat rigid on the couch, her fingers curled around the stem of the wine glass, though she had long since forgotten about drinking. The last whisper of music still echoed in her mind, each note lingering in the air like dust refusing to settle. Upstairs, the door to the master bedroom remained shut. She could picture it clearly in her mind, the way it loomed at the end of the darkened hallway, the way its antique brass handle had felt beneath her fingertips. Had she locked it? No, she was sure she hadn't. But suddenly, she wished she had. The house felt different now. Not hostile, not yet, but alert, attentive. She swallowed, forcing herself to move, to stand, to remind herself that she wasn't some frightened child imagining shapes in the dark. The floorboards murmured softly beneath her feet as she stepped into the hallway. A cool draft curled around her ankles, though no windows had been left open. A glance toward David's study showed him still hunched over his notebook, his head bent low, utterly lost in his work. He hadn't noticed anything. He hadn't heard. She wanted to call out to him, just to break the spell of quiet that had settled over the house, but the words never left her throat. Something inside her hesitated. The stairs loomed ahead, the top swallowed in darkness where the warm glow of the downstairs lamps didn't reach. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to take the first step, then another. Each footfall sounded softer than she expected, as if the house itself was muffling the noise. At the landing, the hallway stretched before her, lined with closed doors. The master bedroom sat at the very end, untouched, waiting. She told herself she was being ridiculous, but her hand still trembled as she reached for the knob. The moment her fingers touched it, the door creaked just a little, just enough. Not because she had moved it, because something on the other side had. Rachel yanked her hand back, her breath catching in her throat. Then the air shifted. The scent of jasmine thickened, curling through the hallway in an invisible tide. Not faint anymore, not just a lingering trace, but fresh, present as though someone had just passed through, their perfume still clinging to the air. Her pulse thundered against her ribs. The door remained closed, still and undisturbed, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that if she opened it now, the room wouldn't be empty. Something waited beyond the threshold. something that had been listening, watching. The silence stretched, impossibly deep. Then the door handle moved. The door handle twisted with slow, deliberate intent. Not the hesitant creak of an old house settling. Not the wind shifting unseen things. This was purposeful. Someone was on the other side. Rachel's body locked in place. Every muscle wound so tightly that even breathing felt impossible. She wanted to move, to flee, to run down the stairs and shake David from his work. But her feet wouldn't obey. The door didn't open, simply waited. A long moment passed. Then, a whisper, soft, so faint it might have been imagined. But Rachel knew she hadn't imagined it. A voice, low and melodic, brushing against the stillness like fingertips trailing over fabric. A single word. Stay. A breath of sound, fragile and distant, but so close. Rachel staggered back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She nearly lost her balance, her hand shooting out to steady herself against the wall. Her fingers found the light switch, and she flicked it on in a blind panic. The hallway flooded with yellow light. The door was still. Nothing moved. Rachel's chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked gasps as she forced herself to look at the handle, her own pulse hammering so hard she thought she might faint. It hadn't turned all the way. Had she imagined it? No, she couldn't have. The weight of the moment still clung to her, thick as fog. The voice had been real. The scent, the shift in the air, the overwhelming sense of not being alone. All of it had been real. She turned and ran. She didn't care how it looked, didn't care if she sounded ridiculous, didn't care if David laughed at her. She ran. Down the stairs, her socked feet nearly slipping against the polished wood. The walls seeming to close in around her as she rushed toward the only place that still felt safe. David looked up in mild surprise as she burst into his study, her breath coming in uneven gasps. "Hey!" he said, blinking at her. "You okay?" Rachel tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. She turned, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway behind her, watching. But nothing followed. The hallway was empty. She swallowed, forcing herself to breathe. "There's something upstairs," she finally whispered. David frowned, setting his pen down. "What do you mean? Did you hear something?" Rachel nodded, arms wrapping around herself. "I heard music, piano music." And then she hesitated, struggling to force the words out. "I think I heard her." David's frown deepened, but there was no amusement in his expression now, just concern. "Rachel, I know how it sounds." Her voice shook. "But I heard the door. I saw the handle move." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, but he didn't dismiss her outright. That was something. "All right," he said after a long pause. "Let's check it out." Rachel didn't want to go back up. Every instinct screamed against it. But she also couldn't just leave it. Leave her. David grabbed a flashlight, more for her sake than any real need, and together they climbed the stairs, the wooden steps groaning beneath their weight. At the end of the hallway, the master bedroom door sat closed, exactly as she had left it. David stepped forward and grasped the handle, giving her a reassuring glance before he turned it and pushed the door open. The room was still, cold, but empty. No sign of movement, no sign of an unseen presence lurking in the corners. Just dust floating lazily in the beam of the flashlight, the bed perfectly made, the antique vanity sitting undisturbed. David let out a breath. "See? Nothing." Rachel's skin prickled. The air still smelled faintly of jasmine. She stepped inside hesitantly, heart pounding against her ribs as she scanned the room. Felt different, like a breath had been exhaled, like something had just stepped away, retreating into the shadows beyond sight. She turned toward the mirror. Her own reflection stared back, but something about it was wrong. The dust that had coated the glass earlier was gone. No, not gone. Disturbed. Rachel stepped closer, her pulse hammering. Faint streaks marred the surface, like fingers trailing through a thin layer of dust. No, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass. The imprint was delicate, slender, feminine. Rachel's breath hitched. Then, as she watched it faded, Right before her eyes, the imprint vanished, dissolving into nothing, as though it had never been there at all. She turned to David, but he hadn't seen it. He was already stepping back toward the door, shaking his head. "This place is getting to you," he murmured. "Let's just get some sleep, okay? It's been a long day." Rachel hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the mirror. She wanted to tell him, wanted to make him see, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down she already knew the truth. Michelle was still here, not in body, but in the house, and she wasn't alone. Something else was with her, and it was watching, waiting, and it didn't want them to leave. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.